Conversations with Rob. Please like and subscribe to our videos. I have a special guest who I'm very fond of. Saw him on quite a few independent media channels, and he's running against the corrupt Nancy Pelosi, which we're thankful he is. This is Shahid Buttar. He is running for California 12. He's a congressional candidate, a constitutional lawyer, and a policy advocate, and also a writer. So Shahid, thanks so much for coming on the program. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Rob. It's great to be with you.
So Shahid, this is going to listeners from all over the country. We're on 10 radio stations, so I definitely want them to hear your message. So can you just tell, first of all, the viewers a little bit about you and growing up and, what you were fighting for?
Thanks, Rob. I'm an immigrant, constitutional lawyer, policy advocate, artist, nonprofit leader. I've spent the last 20 years fighting for the future. I was in law school in the early 2000s, and I went to law school at Stanford to study how to bust big businesses. I studied antitrust. I wanted to work for the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission in fighting big business on behalf of the American people. And in the years that I was studying what passes for law in our country, a set of events that had transpired included the Supreme Court picking a president with incalculably disastrous consequences. I do think that the Bush versus Gore decision was an inflection point in the history of our republic that often goes unnoticed and ignored and overlooked in retrospect. Other things that happened over the 3 years I was in school then included the 9/11 attacks, the passage of the Patriot Act, and Bush's invasion of Iraq. And so at the same time then that I was focused on challenging corporate power to defend the rights, or I should say the workers' rights and economic rights, I witnessed core constitutional rights eclipsed in the beginnings of the expansion of authoritarianism that have continued since. And in those 20 years since, I've fought to defend and expand human rights in the courts, in the policy sphere, as a nonprofit leader, as a direct action activist, and as a community organizer. And I'm eager to continue that work with a seat in Congress. Maybe just one last vignette to close that question. The last time I had an opportunity to basically emulate a member of Congress, that is to say, by asking questions of executive officials, I was arrested for asking the question. And this was a question that addressed mass surveillance, police violence with impunity, and the injustice apparent in what passes for the rule of law. And I'm eager for people to answer my questions instead of arresting me for asking them.
Right. So I want to still get into growing up. With you growing up in Missouri as a Muslim immigrant, talk about that experience. Look at Missouri, it's really white there, let's be honest. So how was that growing up there with, being a Muslim? I don't know how old you are, but I know after 9/11, that was insane being a Muslim in where I'm from, Rhode Island, but even traveling to New York, it was scary for, Muslim people after 9/11 and even years after that. How was that?
For me at the time, it was very different. The 2001 very dramatically shifted my racial identity in the United States because overnight, many of us, particularly from Muslim or South Asian or Middle Eastern backgrounds, went from being perceived as model minorities, largely because we were discriminatorily selected for immigration in the 70s based on professional training and accomplishments. But because there's been this brain drain, the sphere of Muslim, South Asian, and the Middle Eastern immigrants in the United States have generally have largely been professionals, and they include many different classes, including working classes that often get overlooked in this construction of a model minority. But we went from being so-called model minorities to then being presumptive public enemies overnight. And before that, you asked me about growing up in the Midwest. It was frankly fairly idyllic. While most of the state, let's say, is largely white, St. Louis is actually very diverse. And so I grew up in a very diverse milieu while we were in rural Missouri, and our surrounding community was very white. They were, one, very welcoming. Two, we had a faith community in the city that was very, very diverse. And so for me, growing up in Missouri, I had a somewhat idyllic experience, both in the sense that I was insulated from my family's economic challenges. I didn't realize how precarious we were until we lost our house when I was 16. I did have access to very strong public schools, and I'm grateful for those opportunities. And I'll say, with respect to the racial identity and the treatment of my neighbors, I discovered the best of America growing up. I saw white, rural, conservative Americans embrace an immigrant family and treat us like one of their own. The town that I grew up in is called Rosebud, Missouri, and it's a super small town. There's no stoplights. There might be now, but at the time there were none. Our driveway opened onto a state highway. And The entire town, aside from our family of 6, pretty much had 2 last names. There were the Pullmans and the Waymeyers, and the Pullmans and the Waymeyers were lovely to us. You know, our next door neighbors I addressed as uncle and aunt, and it wasn't until I was 7 or 8 years old, frankly, that I even came to understand even the notion of race, that we were from a different place. You know, it was not something that was apparent to me growing up in that isolated a place. But in the years since, I've seen race and the marginalizations associated with it revealed all too starkly to me. And I would say, just to finish the other half of that question, when I was growing up, while the immediate surroundings were very welcoming, when I went to the city and saw the faith community that we lived in and were a part of, I saw the African Americans in our congregation receive very different treatment from banks, authorities, the world, and inequality and its racialization was laid bare for me at a very young age. And at the time, I might have had a privilege. And in the years since, that has eroded due to events. But the one thing here I want to say, just to connect the dots, is that as an intersectional feminist, democratic socialist, I'm eager to address marginalization wherever it occurs. And, one of the crucial lessons, I think, for all of us as change agents and people inclined towards liberation is to look beyond our own experience to understand where marginalization emerges. It is easy to recognize marginalization when it affects each of us. It is more difficult to shed our privileges and step into the shoes and behind the eyes of people who are marginalized to understand their experience. And I think that is the essential task before each of us, to understand our neighbors, to come to understand where we are treated unfairly, and then to remedy that together.
Sure. Do you feel like, as far as the Muslim thing, do you feel like the media just pumped that up? We saw at 9/11, we had a lot of hate crimes, but we see now with,
more specifically, the Muslim thing pumped what up?
With the Muslim religion, with the hate crimes. We also see with President Trump, he makes up all these code words to pit Republican against Democrat, white against black, white against Hispanic, against Muslims. We see all these code things, and do you feel like it's just a lot of politicians, the media? There's not a lot of differences between, me and someone that's black or someone that's Hispanic. It's just we're all working class people. It's just that the media and the politicians such as Trump, and I believe that's why he won, because he manipulated, and he was a con man, and he manipulated people against one another. And I feel like it's not just Trump, it's a lot of other people that are manipulating people. And we see that with unions and I'm in a right to work state as far as Florida. I go into a job for an interview, they play a video saying don't join a union. So we're pitting people against each other. So do you feel like that's the big thing that's going on in our country as far as hating different people that don't look like me or don't act like me?
I don't think it's so much the hate of people who don't act different to us. I think it's our structural institutions pit us against each other, and they prime the pump for that kind of opportunistic vilification of our neighbors. Another way to put that is, yes, I fully agree with you that racism and the tensions between communities are stoked by not just media sources and not just our criminal president, but by any number of forces in our society. But I want to get beyond hate to where it came from. Racism was contrived by capital to split working classes. Racism exists so that white laborers will refuse to ally with black and brown laborers to then together mob up on and seize corporate capital. So I don't think it's hate at all. I think racism and the division among our communities is the predictable result of capital dividing and conquering, as it always has. And it's not Trump. It's not hate. It is, and I would say that racism, I go to Dr. King here, he located racism as inextricably intertwined with capitalism. And it is the fact that we are forced to compete for basic needs, food, shelter, healthcare. It's the fact that we're forced to compete for these things that should be shared goals that prime the pump for this vicious kicking down the stairs of the other who might threaten our relative position. And so all that is to say that without capitalism, I don't know if racism could stick. We might still have hate, but racism isn't just hate. Racism is hate plus prejudice plus institutionalized power that marginalizes people according to the color of their skin or their national origin. And I want to just particularly emphasize here that racism is not an individual prejudice. Racism is worse than prejudice. Racism is institutional. And so, when you ask me about the Muslim thing, I'm not worried about the Muslim thing. I'm worried about the institutionalization of marginalization. And that has nothing to do about being Muslim or immigrant or black or brown. That is capital dividing and conquering. And the more we call capital dividing and conquering Islamophobia or anti-black racism or anti-LGBT phobia, none of those are adequate descriptors of the thing. It's like feeling an elephant in the dark and feeling the tail or the tusk. What we are talking about ultimately is neither capitalism nor hate nor prejudice nor racism. We are talking about fascism. All of those other things are ingredients in a far more noxious soup. So when we criticize Islamophobia, I'm very eager to call out the thing, not just the ingredient. What is Islamophobia part of? It's part of the threat to democracy in the United States that we have fought in the world before, fascism. And I dare say that it is unfortunately growing more consolidated here in the United States. And it's a big part of why I'm running for Congress, because I can't allow Nancy Pelosi to continue to support the consolidation of fascism in the United States any longer.
Let's get into that race. You ran in 2018. It was a crowded field. It was a tough race. What did you learn from running in 2018, which you can use for the 2020 race?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking it. The very first lesson that I learned is to run for the whole cycle. So in 2018, I ran for 3 months at the end of a 2-year cycle. And the reason I ran for 3 months is because I frankly didn't want to run. I was compelled by current events to run. I'm a long-time public interest advocate. I worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation at the time. I frankly liked my job. And I left because I couldn't turn a blind eye to the disservice to our community implicit in the misrepresentation of San Francisco by a relative conservative in Congress. And Nancy Pelosi, as the head of the Democrats in Congress, as the Speaker of the House in this session, unfortunately has done so much to support President Trump, even while demonstrating theatrical resistance made for TV cameras, that I just couldn't sit on the sidelines. While she didn't in 2018 have that same history of the limited and late, ultimately failed impeachment saga in this cycle, I saw even before her support the Trump administration's positions on surveillance powers, on immigration powers, on fiscal austerity spending. And these were issues that I basically couldn't turn a blind eye to. So I ran in 2018 in the same cycle, largely on the same platform as my future colleague, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who I'm very eager to back up in Congress. I won as many votes as she did in 2018, and I'm back now to finish the job. The very first thing that I learned comparing her race to ours was that she ran for 2 years and I ran for 3 months. And so I ran in this cycle for the complete cycle, having gotten involved late in the preceding one. And because I've been in the entire cycle and because I was the first chronologically to enter the race among the challengers, whereas in 2018, I was the last one to file and then the leading progressive at the end of the process. And I was edged for the number 2 position in the primary election that would have put me in the 2018 general election by just half a percentage point at the polls. This year, we have 10 times the support from more than 10 times the people. We have well over 10 times the volunteers. I'm very confident that we'll take second place in March. And then the question becomes, how many people here in San Francisco can we flip between March and November to seize this seat, to end bipartisan corporate rule, and to shake the foundations of Washington, D.C.?
Well, let me ask you this. We talked to, as the viewers and the listeners also heard, Stephen Zunez. He's a professor over at University of San Francisco, and I talked to him about your race. And he seems to think Pelosi is on her way out, regardless if you beat her or she wins again. She's only she's getting pretty much up there, in age, and she's on her way out. Do you believe that, regardless of what happens in this race? She's on her way out, and a progressive will take that seat, whether it's this year or in 2 years.
I don't buy that. The Capitol does not willingly concede. It doesn't disappear into the night. It doesn't step aside. And when she steps aside, there are any number of other conservative aspirants to her seat. They include her daughter. They include State Senator Scott Wiener. Her nephew is the governor of California. We're talking about a powerful political dynasty. And, going back earlier in time, Nancy Pelosi's brother served in the House. Her father was a big city mayor. I mean, this is a powerful political family. And so what happens to her has no implication for the dynasty. And the pretense, I'd love to see this interview or talk with the person you were describing, if he thinks that the Pelosi's are just going to disappear into the night willingly. I unfortunately, I have a bridge that maybe I could sell somewhere. But unfortunately, no, we're going to have to remove her from office. She's not just going to fade. There's too much at stake for the corporations, and Wall Street is not going to give up the opportunity to co-opt the nation's most progressive city easily. Just to play this out, so this year is my maximal moment of opportunity, particularly because the other corporate aspirants to Pelosi's seat aren't willing to challenge her, which is to say I have an open shot at a vulnerable member of a failed predatory corporate system who frankly has an indefensible record. Nancy Pelosi has done so much to empower conservative causes, from participating in the continuing cover-up over CIA human rights abuses, to funding Bush's wars, to turning a blind eye to impeachment under the Bush administration and then showing up late to impeachment under Trump, pursuing a limited process that was destined to fail at the outset. I warned even before she started the impeachment process that the way she was constructing it was set up to fail. And I hate being proven right. It's not the first time. I would rather than be proven right, I would rather have an opportunity to keep us from stepping into these predictable pitfalls going forward. And that's exactly the opportunity I present. And I think that's why we're going to take this seat in November. Maybe another way I'd put this is that San Franciscans are besieged, as a lot of Americans are, by any number of social crises. Here, affordable housing is effectively unavailable, and housing is untenable. It is insane what people go through here just to stay sheltered. And that's not the least of our problems. We also have police violence as an issue. We've had 2 police shootings in the last month and a half here in San Francisco. One of them was by a federal agent. And I am curious why the FBI is harassing and shooting my unhoused neighbors in San Francisco. And I'm not okay with that. And that is happening. There is a long-standing example of environmental racism at the Hunters Point shipyard, where the Navy has toxified and poisoned an entire neighborhood for decades, where the asthma rates and the cancer rates are now through the roof. It's a largely African-American enclave, one of the few remaining in San Francisco. It would be great if they had a powerful federal representative to do something to compel the Navy to show up for the cleanup. And that's exactly what hasn't happened. Across all of these different issues, I see San Francisco just not represented. This is a city where the human rights was founded, and we're represented by someone in Washington who supports human rights abuses. This is a city that is a home of the global movement for environmental sustainability and restorative agriculture, and we're represented in Washington by someone who's puts fossil fuel extraction companies and the military industrial complex before the future generations that she continues to marginalize. I don't see San Francisco being willing to put up with this any longer. But I will say this, it's not as if we can just bet on the Pelosi's fading. We're going to have to fight for this seat. We are fighting for this seat, frankly, 20 hours a day. There are thousands of people around the country with us. And it's going to take every ounce of energy we have to recover the 12th Congressional District seat, to liberate our city's voice in Washington, and to challenge the corporate rule that has unfortunately infected the corporate Democratic Party.
Yeah, you just spoke about it with the unaffordable housing. That's a huge problem in San Francisco. I heard a lot of teachers that teach in the schools, they have to live like 30, 40 miles away and drive in. That's a shame. But my question is, Shahid, and you live there, so you would know the answer to this. Why has she been in office for so long, over 30 years? And I know you talked about the political structure that she has, and that's a fact, and the money and the establishment power. But why have the people not woken up? I mean, they're waking up for you because you're running and there's a lot of backing behind you. But I mean, she's been in there for so long. Why is it taking so long to, get her out of there?
It's a clever question, and it really speaks to a more fundamental rot in our political system. And it is the role of money in politics. You mentioned money, you mentioned the political establishment. She is the political machine. The Democratic Party is political machinery embodied. And I want to play out microcosmically what that looks like. Because Nancy Pelosi raises more corporate capital than anyone in the country, because she's so well funded and effectively can buy anything, any amount of ads, any number of staff, it intimidates potential opponents. And so the people who don't challenge her, who haven't challenged her, at least in the past, include people who have dedicated their lives to public policy, people who have the chops for it, the experience for it, the expertise for it, usually will not want to confront a behemoth with more resources than they could possibly fathom. And I'm somewhat out of that mold. On the one hand, I have spent 20 years fighting in the courts, in Congress, in city councils and state legislatures around the country for civil rights. I know more about federal politics than certainly at Well, let's put it this way. I know more about federal policy than Nancy Pelosi did when she entered Congress, vastly more so. And there's not even a meaningfully relevant comparison. She was a professional fundraiser before she won a seat in Congress. And I've been a policy advocate fighting her for 20 years. And so there's a vast distinction in our respective preparations for the seat. If you look historically, the folks who have challenged her have been people that I have supported, community activists, organizers, including a teacher, artists, people who have had the movement of the progressive city behind them, and mounted well-intentioned campaigns, but people who struggled to secure the resources to challenge Pelosi across the city. And I think because I have 20 years of experience, in addition to the support of the local progressive community, we've been very fortunate. I am very grateful to have received so much support, not just from every neighborhood in San Francisco and every city in the Bay Area, all across the great state of California, but across our entire country, and frankly, even well beyond. There are U.S. citizen expats around the world who are contributing to our campaign. And as a child of the British Empire, I find that very humbling insofar as it is fair to say that the sun never sets on our support base. And unlike Her Majesty and her forebears, I didn't wage any wars of neo or imperial aggression to gain that base, right? But I see that movement around the world coming together, focusing its energy and resources here in San Francisco, recognizing that Nancy Pelosi plays such a pivotal role in ensuring climate chaos, in protecting the military-industrial complex, in guarding a corporate predatory failed healthcare system. In each of these areas, if we want universal healthcare, if we want global peace, if we want a Green New Deal and climate sustainability, we can't just elect a new president. We have to recover the Democratic Party. And as long as Nancy Pelosi is in the way, serving the interests of, for instance, she recently embraced Mike Bloomberg, a former Republican, unapologetically racist New York mayor, an oligarch billionaire. And the idea that we're going to take one racist oligarch New York billionaire from the White House and replace him with another one makes my stomach turn. And the idea that the mayor of San Francisco has formally embraced that man, and that Nancy Pelosi has as the democratically elected Speaker of the House, I'll just say it's disqualifying. You can't claim to be a Democratic leader and embrace former Republicans as Democratic nominees for president. Full stop, period. I'm done. And I think San Francisco gets it. San Francisco doesn't want political leaders who will welcome Republicans running as Democrats. San Francisco is a progressive town. It's a peace and justice town. It's a climate justice town. It's a labor town. And we're here to recover the city's voice in Washington in the service of all of our shared values.
So is this something to worry about with the primaries coming up on March 3rd? We saw what happened to Bernie Sanders in 2016 in the primary, the NPA voting, and there was all that shenanigans with that. We honestly, I believe that Bernie Sanders won the California primary in 2016 with all the shenanigans they pulled on him, rather. Are you worried about that? Like you said, you're going against the top of the heap for the political establishment. She's loaded with money, and she could pull all the same shenanigans they did against Sanders, and I'm sure they're going to try to do it again against him in 2020 in his primary, as they're going to do against you in your primary. They could be pulling the same tricks. So are you worried about that?
Not for March. I'll put it this way. The place where they will attempt their shenanigans, and I do suspect that there will be any number of attacks on the electoral process from foreign state intelligence actors, from Republicans, and likely from establishment Democrats. I think that November is the greater threat for those hijinks, let's say, than March, for a couple different reasons. First, when we look at 2016, the 2016 primary in California, the biggest threat to it was the Associated Press calling the election the night before it happened. It was absolutely insane that was allowed. I mean, I've never seen a more unapologetically bold, public, overt attack on election legitimacy than for the Associated Press to decide the California election before it ever happened. And it amazes me that the millions of residents across the state weren't outraged by that, because it just denied any opportunity. It was already the case that California, by voting in June, had to some extent resigned itself to effective irrelevance in the presidential primary process. But then for the AP to formally just disregard the state's votes entirely and just assign them to Clinton a day before the election, I remember feeling at the time outraged, and not just outraged, I would say also seeing through the illusion of what passes for our democracy. And you raise this cleverly with the question of the hijinks. When we think we live in a democracy, we ignore that we actually live in a capitocracy, right? Capitalism is not just the opportunity to make money in markets. Capitalism is the rule over people by capital. It's what corporate rule represents. That's what we live in. Democracy would be rule of the people. It is exactly what I and President Sanders offer, is a recovery of democracy, a rejection of the plutocracy implicit either in the kleptocracy, the rule by thieves that we see under Trump, or the plutocracy and oligarchy, that is to say the rule by wealthy and the rule of the few that we see under the corporate paradigm defended by corporate Democrats. And another way I'd say this is that for the March primary, because we have a jungle primary, a top two system, I'm very assured of being in the race until November. Something very dramatic would have to happen for another candidate to displace me for the second place position that would put me in an opportunity to then have an intra-Democratic Party general election contest in November. But in November, when it's Bernie versus Trump, I absolutely expect there to be attacks on our electoral process, even when Trump isn't on the ballot. For instance, in Iowa, the Iowa Democratic caucuses, just within the Democratic Party, we had a completely co-opted, unreliable, unrepresentative, illegitimate, undemocratic process. And if that's what the Democrats do to each other, wait till the Republicans are in the room. It's going to get worse. And, I've said often that a lot of people are concerned about election insecurity in the context of hacking the machines. It's an absolutely legitimate worry. The only way to reliably tabulate votes is with paper ballots, with a paper trail, receipts. But beyond the machines, it doesn't take electronics to hack an election. We hack elections every day. We see, for instance, particularly when the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. I believe the name of the decision was Shelby County. After that case, by striking down the provision that required Southern jurisdictions to pre-clear changes to their voting rights laws with the Justice Department to ensure that they would not marginalize racial minorities, in the wake of that decision, right-wing legislatures across states, across the country, started instituting new restrictions on the vote, voter ID laws, purging the rolls, and that's hacking an election. When you knock people off the rolls and disqualify them from voting when they are qualified voters, that's hacking an election. When you see career representatives team up in the redistricting process to carve up their states into arbitrary boundaries to effectively choose who their constituents are and contrive their own re-elections, that too is hacking an election. When we let powerful, wealthy business people buy their way onto presidential debate stages, as Mike Bloomberg has done, that's hacking an election. So the election's been hacked. It's been getting hacked in the open, just not using computers, using the legal mechanisms and the opportunities for capital to undermine democracy. We're witnessing that before our eyes as we speak. It's one reason why I'm so committed to our next president, our first Jewish president, Bernie Sanders. It's why I'm particularly gassed at even the suggestion that Mike Bloomberg should be the Democratic nominee. And it's one reason why I'm very eager to replace Nancy Pelosi as San Francisco's voice in Washington.
I want to get into that right now. You spoke about Iowa, and we spoke about what happened in New Hampshire. Bernie won by over 4,000 votes, 3,000 to 4,000 votes, and then he gets just about the same amount of delegates as Pete Buttigieg. I mean, it's insanity. But my thing is with that is, how can you be so secure? And I love Bernie too. I'm originally from Rhode Island. We're right around the corner from Vermont. But I'm worried that guys like you, him, and other progressives around the country, they're just going to screw him in November, as you said, with the rigging of the votes. I mean, you spoke earlier on what happened in Florida in 2000. We saw police driving around with ballots. Nobody knows where half of those ballots were. We saw in the Florida election in 2018 with Andrew Gillum, they had the bomb scare with in the Miami-Dade mail office, and a lot of those ballots were absentee ballots. They never got counted. Andrew Gillum lost by 30,000 votes. So, I mean, that wasn't a Democratic ploy or anything, but it's still votes not being counted and the election system not letting them count those votes. So, I don't know, maybe you're, more, I don't know the word to say, but maybe you're more in trust with the system that Bernie Sanders can beat Trump. But I just, as much as I love Bernie, the way they're doing it right now, as you said, with Bloomberg, letting him on the stage. Tulsi Gabbard had to get her votes and get her fundraising to go on stage. Cory Booker didn't do it. Andrew Yang wasn't able to do it. They just pushed those people aside, and now Bloomberg gives the DNC for over $300,000, and they just let him on the stage. So how can we really trust these guys when what they did in 2016 and what they've done in elections past?
Great question, and I would say we can't trust them.
Yeah.
Full stop. Now, there's a couple different implications of that. One implication, and I fear this implication, and I want to be explicit that this is not the lesson to draw, but again, I fear people taking the lesson from the fact that we can't trust the process, taking the lesson that they should then advocate and resign it. And that's a dangerous lesson. We can't let that happen. Even if we can't trust the process, the answer is not to abandon it. It is to lean in, seize it, and escalate. Let me unpack that. We each embrace and encounter our democracy in the settings where we find ourselves, right? And when we talk about trust in the system, 20 years ago, long before I ran for Congress, even before I was a lawyer, I was organizing grassroots demonstrations to lay siege to San Francisco the morning after Bush invaded Iraq and to shut down a Lockheed Martin facility in the weeks after the election. I have no trust in our corporate system at all. I know that it is built, it is engineered, it is designed to grind people into dust and feed on us. That's what capitalism means. And that is to say that I recognize, even before running for Congress, that the process has been co-opted. Again, I'd go back to just the role of money in politics. It doesn't take hacking an election to compromise the legitimacy of it. In fact, I would say I'm entering a contest, an electoral contest against Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the legitimacy of which has already been undermined by the fact that she has millions of dollars in corporate cash, right? So I know what I'm entering is not a level playing field. That is inescapably obvious to anybody paying attention. But I put it this way, and this is why I'm so excited about Bernie. If we win at the ballot box by an inescapably large margin and can document it with exit polls, there's nothing that the establishment can do to deny us the legitimacy of our victories. And then the question becomes, what about my neighbors? At the end of the day, any candidate running for office, we demonstrate trust not in the system, but in our neighbors. I'm offering myself to my neighbors as their voice, and I'm relying on them to choose me. If the process is co-opted or broken, we as candidates also rely on our neighbors to hold the system accountable. That's what I was doing when I laid siege to San Francisco as a direct action organizer 20 years ago. That's what I was doing when I shut down the Lockheed Martin plant. That's what I was doing when we were doing light brigades outside Obama's White House to end NSA spying, when we were doing banner drops outside the NSA headquarters. Those are acts of resistance. And the point here is that I'm not just an electoral actor. I am an interdisciplinary liberation agent, and I engage politics with a direct action history, with a policy advocacy history. And the long story there short is if the election process is so unreliable that Americans don't have faith in the result, I would like to see us take action. 9 years ago, I was a very active participant in the Occupy movement, and I visited 20 different sites around the country because I was in the middle of that fall of a national speaking tour. It happened to be the 10th anniversary of the Patriot Act, which I was professionally dedicated to reversing. And so I went to dozens of Occupy sites around the country, and I saw up close and personal a movement whose vindication I think we are now living through. People said at the time that Occupy was unsuccessful. I don't think it was unsuccessful when Bernie Sanders is going to be the next president, and he's already setting the agenda for the national political discussion. Occupy represented the immediate. Now we are witnessing the longer term maturation of a political generation that the political corporate establishment classes were so successful on preying upon. And I'm going back to the 2008 financial crisis here and the co-optation of the Obama administration by Joe Biden and by Wall Street and the TARP bailout that bailed out Wall Street instead of Main Street. People who were young people at the time in college and just getting out, they were so screwed, they watched their futures evaporate. And when we see AOC coming into Congress, when we see Bernie now coming into the White House, when we see me replacing Pelosi, these are all events that represent the maturation of that generation, right? The establishment might have been able to force us out of the street, but now we are coming back for the ballot box. And if the electoral process can't be trusted, we have to go back to that level of assertive engagement of the process. And I don't just mean occupations. I certainly don't mean just marches. I'm talking about a general strike. There is only one tool that we, the people, ultimately have to force our institutions, to treat us fairly and legitimately. And that ultimately is work stoppages. And I've said this for 20 years. If we are not organizing the capacity for a general strike, we are effectively wasting our time. And at the moment, I'm not doing that. I'm focused on challenging Nancy Pelosi. I talk about this as an opportunity because I recognize the need for we the people to claim our own sovereignty. I'll try to make this quick, but there's a really important point here. Popular sovereignty is the basis for democratic legitimacy in our Constitution. It is also the recipe. It's the solution. Popular sovereignty is the solution to times like this when we have institutional delegitimation. What do you do when the institutions no longer represent us? We claim our sovereignty. That's what the Occupy movement represented. That's what our races represent. And if the electoral system should so fail us, whether it's because the machines are hacked, whether it's because the Russians interfere, whether it's because Trump won't leave office even if he loses, whether it's because Pelosi has so much corporate capital that we can't fight on a level playing field, or whether it's because the Republicans purged all the voters, under any of those scenarios, we can't trust the result. And under any of those scenarios, we have to escalate. I've been escalating for 20 years. I'm eager for my neighbors. In fact, my neighbors have been joining me, certainly in the context of this electoral race. I hope very much that we win by a sufficient margin, that there won't be an opportunity for the institutional establishment to engage in that kind of chicanery. If it does happen, again, I trust my neighbors to raise our own voices in the various ways that we have available.
Right. And I don't be short. I really enjoy this. This is like a lesson for me. You are you're like an amazing teacher, somebody that I can listen to for years upon years on end. But I want to talk about this. You brought up about being an activist. This goes into this. We see in France with the Yellow Vest movement that kids, adults, people of all ages taken to the streets and fighting against Emmanuel Macron, who is basically a neoliberal in France. In this country, we saw with Occupy, and I agree that was a great movement, but why can't America be more like France and do that Yellow Vest movement consistently? I mean, we do have a lot of activists that, go against Keystone, and other pipelines, and that's happened in this country. But I believe that this isn't happening, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, in this country, is because we don't have Medicare for all. If people that, they can't sit out of work, because if they ever get sick and their work pays their coverage, they get fired, they lose their medical coverage, or they lose all their benefits regardless. So do you agree with that fully?
Yeah, you nailed it. Another way to put it, and I think you have a very apt microeconomic analysis that I want to explain in the context of the language of political history and economy. The way you put it is that without Medicare for all, if someone doesn't go to work, they can end up on the street, or their kid can get sick, or their elderly parent can not have access to medicine. And that is an existential lever that forces people. It subjugates people. Not having access to healthcare as a matter of right is a subjugating influence. And I don't want to use the word enslaving because that's a little bit strong, but the point here is that we can't claim to be free when we are reliant on the market for our healthcare or our food or our housing. Another way to put that historically is that corporations have proven so successful at preying on the American public that we are now so backed into a corner that we can't even guard our own interests because we have to basically be making money all day just to put food on the table and keep a roof over our kids' homes and make sure that they can get to a nurse. That represents a historical victory by capital, eclipsing labor, forcing labor into a corner and diminishing its influence. But this is always the hole in that bucket, is that there are more of us. There are more people who work for a living than there are of them, of people who get by and have vast fortunes by preying on the labor of the rest of us. And if we just realize our collective political potential, if we place human rights at the center of our social equation, instead of engineering all of our various policies to facilitate wealth accumulation, if we put human rights and human needs at the center, I think that we can not only gain Medicare for all, which will help Americans sleep at night, which will keep people in their homes, which will enable the kind of expression that you're describing that Americans don't have the opportunity to consider at the moment. I think that it would be not only a victory for human rights and a reduction in healthcare costs in the aggregate and an improvement of healthcare outcomes, but it would be constitutionally empowering in the way that you're describing. It would improve the speech opportunities for Americans if we weren't reliant on our corporate overlords for the opportunity to get medicine if we or our parents or our kids get sick.
Yeah. Shahid, you're 100% right, and I appreciate that. I have 3 to 4 questions left. I want to talk more about what's happening rather in San Francisco. We talked about the affordable housing crisis there. Homelessness crisis is huge over there because of that issue. Do you believe that, first of all, I want to know what you see to fix that issue, but do you believe all these issues come together? We talk about Medicare for all, the minimum wage, homelessness, affordable health care, the Green New Deal, which is a basis of all that stuff put together. I mean, and then you got all these Republicans and Democratic establishment guys on TV running for office. They make fun of democratic socialism and democratic socialists such as yourself and me. But we need, in this country, you talked about hate too. We get rid of a lot of that hate if you put a little bit of democratic socialism in this country. We have socialism for the rich people, for Donald J. Trump and all of his cronies in the country, but we don't have any socialism for the regular people, the other 300 some odd million people in the country.
You nailed it. I think you're absolutely right. It's ironic to have this conversation on Valentine's Day, right? Which is a Hallmark holiday dedicated supposedly to love. I love my neighbors, I love my country, and I love this world. I love my species, and I care about all of us deeply. It's why I'm a democratic socialist. Love is justice in public. That's what Dr. Cornel West teaches us. He's one of our endorsers, someone by whom I've long been inspired. And that idea that we demonstrate our mutual care for each other, not just in acts of service to each other, not just in volunteering in our communities, but by supporting social policies that pool our resources to meet our shared needs. That is a demonstration of civic love. And it's one that I'm excited to demonstrate every day. It's one I'm excited to see every day in the thousands of people that are supporting our campaign in all the various ways that there are. And I do think very much that this you asked if all these issues come together, and intersectionality is the recognition that different dimensions of marginalization compound on each other. And I think part of your question was, what do we do about homelessness? Medicare for all is probably the longest lever that we can pull to ensure that people stay in their homes, because the leading cause of homelessness is medical bankruptcy. And when people see unhoused people, sometimes Americans jump to the conclusion is, oh, that person was unsuccessful, or maybe that person made bad choices, or maybe that person is an addict. The statistically most likely answer is that person got sick, ran out of money, and then our corporate predatory healthcare system kicked them into the street. That's why our unhoused neighbors are there. Another big part of the equation is to restore the federal spending on affordable housing, both through the neoliberal paradigm of community development block grants through HUD. This is a budget for which Nancy Pelosi has presided over an 80% decline during her tenure in office, while spending on wasteful, fraudulent, unnecessary military contracts has flown through the roof. So it's not like we haven't had the money. She just hasn't seen fit to spend it on the needs of San Franciscans. So increasing the budget for affordable housing and building a new pipeline of social housing. This is part of the Green New Deal for public housing. We've had disappointing experiences with public housing in the United States in the past. The key to making it work going forward is to ensure that social housing is accountable to the communities that live in the units. That's a design process that we need to build. And I think it's a big part of the reinvigoration of social housing, the resuscitation of affordable housing, meeting the needs of our community, and ensuring that people can stay in their homes.
Right. Thank you for saying that. We saw the Trump budget that just came out, and it's basically cut and snap. But these are cuts for the people that need it the most. I have a family member that's severely handicapped, another family member that has autism. So this, comes near and dear to my heart. So with the cut to food stamps, SNAP, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, it's just all these cuts. I mean, we just talked about the socialism for the rich and the cuts for the poor. If you get into power, how will you stand up against the neoliberals like Nancy Pelosi, as who you're running against? They support Trump's budget. They support Trump's military budget, a $67 billion budget, but they don't want to fund these programs. How will you stand up to people like that? Because there's a lot of them in Congress on the Democratic side and the Republican side.
You're absolutely right. The very first way I'm going to stand up to them is by removing their leader from Congress. And I think when we remove the most well-funded corporate Democrat from the House, it's going to send a pretty loud signal. And it's going to send a signal that if you represent an urban area as a centrist, you are not safe. You're either going to show up for your constituents, or we, the progressive movement, will show you the door. And this is about ending careerism and displacing it with democracy. And again, at the end of the day, I think that people are either going to get on this train to meet the needs of our neighbors, or we're going to push them out of the house. And I'll be clear. I mean, if there are corporate Democrats who are going to vote against their constituents in the service of corporate rule, I'm not afraid to show up in their districts. And I will recruit challengers. I mean, I have no fealty to incumbents. Nancy Pelosi is so committed to incumbent Democrats that she has endorsed Dan Lipinski, a reproductive authoritarian challenging Marie Newman, a liberal challenger in her district in Illinois. Nancy Pelosi's also endorsed Henry Cuellar in Texas over Jessica Cisneros. This is another progressive challenger who supports the Green New Deal, who supports Medicare for all. We're not asking anymore. If these corporate Democrats, and they have already proven themselves repeatedly unwilling to show up for their constituents and their communities and instead cast their lot with corporations, we're done. We're just going to remove those people. And when you ask how we're going to work with them, the way we're going to work with them is by educating their constituents and removing them and replacing them. At the end of the day, there's going to be a further fight in Congress. There are a lot of opportunities, despite the narrative of partisan dysfunction, to move the ball forward. Not so much, I would say, discreetly with respect to social spending, addressing the needs of our most marginalized, but at least at containing the dimensions of authoritarianism that threaten to consolidate fascism in the United States. I know that's a longer conversation that we probably don't have time. In fact, I don't have time for that now, but I'd love to develop that.
No worries, Shahid. Thanks so much for explaining it. Two more questions. How do you get to these people? And I'm sure even though you're in a bastion of progressivism in San Francisco, but people come up to you and they say, how are you going to pay for it? We kind of did that in the last question about, $767 billion to the military. Why not cut it?
Yeah, it's the military. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. So just to be quick here, we waste vast sums on the military. We have the money for Medicare for all. We have the money for the Green New Deal. The single easiest place to reclaim this money is by ending the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, because there's literally $2 trillion in that bucket that could be reclaimed. The Pentagon has lost track of $21 trillion over the last two generations. That is absolutely unconscionable. And we might say, well, that's water under the bridge. We can't get it back. The intelligent answer is, well, figure out where it's going and shut down the bleeding. I know the CIA is probably part of that. I would like to close the CIA. I'd like to close ICE, and I'd like to close CBP. That's billions upon billions of dollars on the table for us to redivert and rededicate to better social uses.
Lastly, thanks so much for coming on the program, Shahid Buttar. I want to hear, lastly, can you tell the voters where people can find you, how they can donate, volunteer, whether it's text messaging, phone calling from any state across the country?
Thanks, Rob. I so appreciate, again, you bringing me on and that opportunity. Folks across the country are helping us with phone banking from about a dozen different cities. People all over the country are text banking. Anybody can get involved. Visit us online at www.shahidforchange.us or on any of the major social networking platforms, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, at Shahid for Change.
All right, Shahid, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Right on. Thanks for having me, Rob. It's good to talk to you. Keep up the good work, bro.